As an opening, my courses are so far from McGuell's. I really would love to join McGuell. Your course sounds wonderful. I did a lot of this work on a large first-year science course. And in that course, when we're trying to engage our students, there is a group of them that just love the material. And we probably were all those students, which makes it very hard for us to relate to some of the others, but they just show them a molecule and they're excited. Some of them, I just feel like I've got to do comedy to keep them engaged, song and dance routine. Some of them are totally obsessed with the learning outcomes and ticking a few boxes. Some of them want personalised feedback for every minute of the day. And on top of that, I have the bean counters with a very strict budget as to how I'm going to implement this. Hands up those in this position. Right or left hand. Put them both up. And those people up the back who didn't put their hands up, I know you are. Okay. Just a little bit of paraphrasing. I'm sorry for a couple of people who might have seen this before. From Tolstoy. This is the first sentence of Anna Karenina. Anyone who's a reader of classics? And he had it about happy families. I think all good students are alike. Each poor student struggles in his or her own way, and that's what makes it hard to get a universal plan to help our weaker students. Second one is from JFK. Ask not what we can do for our students, but what they can do for themselves with encouragement from us. And I think you'll probably all recognise that one. Okay, the challenge, summarising. We need teaching initiatives that can somehow in a way drive themselves. I haven't been as successful as I'd like to be with that. That engage the students in an activity which will progress their learning approach. And I love that idea of the dashboard, that idea of the student trying to self-monitor, and we're a long way from that. I don't mean to sound negative, but we are. And the initiative, unfortunately, with large courses tends to have to fit to budgetary and class size constraints. Okay, we tried a massively, the more I think about it, the more ambitious it was a few years ago now, which we finally published. And this is my favourite graph from this paper. We had MBLG1, which was in 2015 had 1,400 and something students. And we introduced PeerWise very much along the same principles as yours, Miguel. We offered them 3%. They were assigned a learning outcome. They had to write a question. It was in midway through. They had to go and answer a certain number, and they had to comment on a certain number. We got an education and teaching grant to do this, so we were able to employ people to go and mark them as well, all 1,400 of them. But what I loved about PeerWise, that none of the other initiatives I've tried in the past, and we have tried quite a few, between Gareth and I, we've tried a lot, was the bottom end, well, I shouldn't call it like that, the bottom quartile were improved. So let me just explain this graph. The average mark on the side does not include the 3% PeerWise, but it was the final mark for MBLG1, which was known very well throughout the university as quite a challenging course. HPA is high PeerWise activity, LPA is low PeerWise activity, and this was based on their mark in the PeerWise activity. And like Miguel said, Miguel, that's right, they got half marks for doing what we asked them to do. They got extra marks, so 1.5 marks was for doing what we asked them to do. Below that, you were a low PeerWise. And here's the bit that I really liked. Now, anyone who's been in a large course, you get your top students, and everything you give, the top students take on board, and they will do. So all that happens in the end is you end up with this massive lot of HDs, which are all your engaged students, and then this incredible tail at the bottom. Because you have to give everything to everybody, the more you give, the worse it gets. your distribution in the end often looks biphasic. I think ours still looks biphasic. But what had happened here was these guys at this end got the best benefit out of it. So I was very excited. Excuse the next slide. That is the legend under that. If anybody asks me any questions about the numbers. And this was what a lot of people otherwise were very excited about, was the fact, though I had to front up to the Standards Committee and explain why I had too many HDs that year, but I had a much better pass rate. The grey was the 2014, the blue was the 2015. And as it happened, both courses in both years were almost exactly the same number of students. We had 1,439 one year and 1,434 the next, and I can't remember which way round it went. They came from the same set of selection, HSC, etc. And we tried as best we could to keep the MCQs the same. So as far as I could see, this was never a better control. And when I first saw this at the end of the year, I panicked because I was going to have to go up against the Standards Committee, but everybody else was very excited by this. Anyway, moving on. So we ran MBLG for the last time in 2016. We did the PeerWise again, and we actually got a more extreme result, but the class sizes meant I couldn't really compare it in all honesty, but it certainly did agree with it. 2018 arrives, a new course in second year, which had only about 300 students, but was going up to 700 the next year. So we embarked on PeerWise again. Now, reflection and discussion, we had decided that if PeerWise was so good in first year, with one round, we would do 5 rounds. I know a linear relationship. If 1 is good, then 5 is 5 times better. We had included fortnightly timetable tutorials in collaborative learning space, and we certainly used those. Our discussions, and this was a more anecdotal and subjective way, but we felt that it was actually the authoring of the questions that was helping the most. So we dived in, boots and all. The result was mixed. I'd love to say the result was fantastic. It was mixed, but we learnt a lot from it. And I got the feedback from a large range of sources, but one of the most important ones was some anecdotal comment, and I have it, or did have until it was swiped card denied, an office that was quite open where students would pop in and chat to me. Not all 700 of them, or 1,400 of them, but quite a number of them. And it was these discussions where I realised that my students didn't trust a total peer evaluation. This was always going to be the problem. The other one, well, on further discussion was they didn't have quite the discernment skills and they didn't really know how to write an MCQ. Now, this was despite the fact that I did spend a whole tutorial introducing how to write one. But the students at this level admitted that they probably struggled with that. And I think on reflection, and this is certainly something open for discussion, that it takes 2 things to do an MCQ. You have to know the subject material well, and you also have to understand MCQs. Now, I'm not going to put my students down because I think in some ways they understand MCQs very well. They've done a lot of them. They have the lived experience of answering them. They just had trouble translating that into writing a good one. So this year, we tried to tap into those problems, and this is where I'm really open for some suggestions. We maintained the fortnightly timetable tutorial, but we made the first couple of cycles much simpler. So we did introduce Bloom's taxonomy and the verbs very early in the piece, and in each tutorial I would give some examples of each level. And this way I could do a little bit of stand up and deliver, which is what they wanted out of the tutorial. They wanted me to stand there and give them past paper questions and give them the explanation. I was able to kind of tap into this a little bit. In the first one, and we're quite excited about this, though I haven't had the final surveys yet, but the students themselves are quite excited about this. we started getting them to write a true-false statement. So we contacted Paul and figured out how to set it up. A true-false statement is much easier. We allocated them a lecture each. They sat in their groups and divvied up that lecture, and they wrote a true-false. They had to write 2 true-false statements, go out and answer 40, and it was worth 1%. The second one was more or less calling their bluff, because when we give them PeerWise activities, some of them would go off onto the internet to try and find a question. And this was, I didn't really mind, but the students saw, they lost a bit of street cred in the students' minds. I think if you go out to the internet and find something, you've thought about it. But we said to them, go off to the internet and find a question on 2 particular areas in our course. And the kids loved it. Sorry, the students loved it. And in the tutorial I called, and there's so many questions, I called up a few just to give examples. And we had to submit it with an explanation and suggestions on how to make it better. And the idea very quickly came around, let's find a bad one, because then I can make some good suggestions on how to make it better. It wasn't hard to find a bad one. Trust me, they were all recall. In fact, the students themselves became aware just how much MCQ can simply be recall. So we had a lot of fun with that, and that was worth 2%. And both the first 2, I just used the PeerWise metrics to give the mark, and a database, needless to say. Then we were ready to write our own MCQ, and they had to write 1 MCQ. And I did go through how to use the true-false statements, how to construct the MCQ, and even had to give them, what I think is fair enough though, a plan on how to go about it. It became in the end, and I'm still struggling with this, how to get the right balance between peer evaluation and expert input, given also the budgetary constraints that we have. So we had a whole lecture on how to take our true-false statements, some of which Paul had downloaded for me. We just had to get rid of all the rubbish, all the, HTML code. And then we had our higher order skills, and my off-sider Giselle and I would mark them all. We're 3/4 of the way through that. As we mark them, we're actually giving them suggestions, so we're building up an email to send to each one of them. They will be available this week. I've just put that, and the students, what is interesting that this year, the students are begging us to give them back access to all the true-false statements, to that pool of internet ones and to the ones they wrote themselves. The students themselves, it is week 13 this week, are looking for this for revision. And if I got any time left? If I could just go through, this was the 3rd tutorial, and this is kind of what I felt I had to do in the end with our students to really get some good quality stuff. The stuff we're marking, a lot of it is really good. So first off, each student was allocated a particular learning outcome, and with 700 students, that becomes quite a tricky process. They had a code they had to look up in Canvas on marks, and then they had to go to a table to work that out. So in the tutorial, made sure everybody knew which learning outcome they were working on before they left. The obvious stuff that probably with classes with older students, more mature age students, and that you don't have to do, but we had to do that. The first thing which we experimented with was tapping into the truth-false statements and getting them to write 5 statements about the learning outcome. That was a really good way to just get them going. And as we started to do that, I gave them a couple of examples, they suddenly could see that they were revising the material. You could see from their faces that they suddenly saw this was a way to revise their material. Start making an MCQ that is recall only. Start with and I made a point, lowest level of learning. And then I had these suggestions, which then moved on to the second slide. And this was where we really tapped into thinking deeper. Consider how the information was first discovered. I'm in molecular biology and biochemistry. Everything about the subject, as I say to anyone who'll listen, is discovered by experimentation. And so think how the information was first discovered, what techniques were used and how we would exploit them, inhibitors, mutations, what context would it be particularly useful, identify misconceptions and use as plausible distractors. And one last thing is from the original courses, I downloaded a few of their true-false statements and showed them how to take these statements that they had written and turn it into an MCQ. Just a basic recall MCQ. So a lot of that third tutorial was spent teaching them how to do it. And now I have, or Giselle and I have, a very good bank. Most of those questions are good for revision. Some are better than others, but they're all good for revision. So I'll leave it at that.